And Charlie Mitchell, the editor of InsideCybersecurity.com and also the author of Hacked, the inside story of America's struggle to secure cyberspace. He's right here with us in the Dell TIA NOW studio at the TIA 2016 Network of the Future event in Dallas, Texas. And Charlie, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Thanks for being here. And I have to admit, I have not read the book, but it's a pleasure to have you here to sort of break it down for us. Give us the quick synopsis.
Great. Well, thank you. Hacked is really the story of the way the political system and important U.S. industries try to grapple with a problem that affects all of us. This affects you and your daily home life. It affects you at your job. It affects the biggest industries in the country. And I tried to break it down into how the policy was developing, what the problem was, how these hacks have really changed the business equation in this country in a huge way. So identifying the problem and then walking people through the story of the way their elected leaders and the way their companies have all tried to deal with it.
Now tell me about the most notable sort of global cyber attacks that maybe influenced the book.
Sure, absolutely. Well, we saw in 2013 a series of attacks against the financial sector, which, as you can imagine, is one of the more resilient sectors out there. It's where the money is, as Willie Sutton would say. They were getting bombarded with cyber attacks, going in trying to do attacks known as DDoS attacks, distributed denial of service attacks, which were trying to really bring down the whole system. And this was a different order of magnitude in terms of cyber crime. Previously, you would have theft, and that would be expected. Now, all of a sudden, you had attacks against the banking system designed to wreck the banking system, which, as you can imagine, it freaked people out a little bit, and people weren't sure what was going on and what should be done about it. But we were watching that. There were a whole series of attacks against major retailers, which you probably remember some of those. Virtually anywhere that you might have shopped, these places were breached in the 2013-2014 period. And this was getting a great deal of attention. But the funny thing is, you talk about the most notable cyber attacks. I think the one that really crystallized this problem in a lot of people's minds was the attack on Sony Pictures right before Christmas in 2014, where there were threats made against Sony Pictures by reportedly by a North Korean group, and it was related to the release of a satire that the North Koreans took great offense at. They basically said, don't release this or we will inflict great damage on you. Mm-hmm. Sony was in a very difficult situation. There were threats against moviegoers. This was a whole different thing. And they did release the picture, and this group did attack, and it really wasted, just a multitude of computer systems and files and all of that. The FBI quickly traced it back to North Korea, but this was an attack by a nation state against an American company on our soil with direct impacts. And so that just changed the equation from these little annoying attacks that, would steal a couple of dollars from your credit card account or whatever to, wow, this is almost akin to war. And it is war.
Let's talk about what the U.S. Congress and U.S. law enforcement can do, or really global law enforcement can do to combat these cybersecurity threats. Is it beyond the reach of any government to be able to handle these amount of threats and the heaviness and density of it?
Well, it's very, very difficult, and you hit on a good point that it requires not just one government, it requires all of the governments to work together, and there's a lot of effort being put into that to collaborate on an international scale between governments, between the EU and the United States, and between the United States and Japan. There's a great deal of collaboration. Here at home, it took about 6 years or so for Congress to actually produce a cybersecurity bill. And the decision was made, of all the things that could be done, information sharing was identified as the first real important building block to a good, solid cybersecurity strategy. And Congress started in about 2010 trying to pass an information sharing bill, and they couldn't get it done. There were all kinds of questions about how do you protect privacy within this? What happens if your personal data gets swept up into this and gets released, and who's responsible for that? And also you had a pretty natural reluctance on the part of businesses to share with the government, and they were a little bit afraid of the repercussions of this. And if I tell the government I was hacked, is that going to make me liable for some kind of regulatory action, some kind of civil suit or whatever? So getting the liability protection right was a huge question. It was very controversial, and it took years to get a bill through. A bill was finally passed last December 2015, and now they're in the process of trying to implement this and trying to make it work.
Charlie, can you give us a little bit of a insight in the looking glass and behind the scenes, if you will, of how Washington policymakers really approach these cyber attacks, and just from your experience?
Sure. I think it's really interesting because it shows the ways that our system does work, and it really shows the ways our system doesn't work, which sometimes can be pretty alarming. You have in Congress, you have a handful of lawmakers, including Mike McCall from here in Texas, and a guy named Tom Carper, a senator from Delaware. I put them up there as two of the really most astute cyber policymakers. Now, they started behind the scenes. One's a Texas Republican, one's a Delaware liberal. They started working together years ago and talking about this and trying to inch it through and trying to find the areas of compromise that could advance it. And it was a really long struggle to advance this policy. And one of the dirty little secrets of the way Washington works is that there were turf battles. There were committees that wanted a piece of this, and so you had a critical national security issue that was being held up because one committee didn't want another committee's bill to advance. It took a long time. It took a certain amount of shaming, and you really have to almost embarrass lawmakers into saying, well, I'm going to have to give up my little parochial interests in order to make this happen. And that eventually did happen, and it did get through. It was, some people say it was too little too late, but I think it was an important foundational piece that finally got through and finally made it through what's really an obstacle course. Our legislative process is a complete obstacle course, and if you can accomplish anything, it's usually a half a loaf, it's usually a little late, but hopefully this is an important building block that makes our systems more secure.
Charlie, we only have a minute left, but I do want to get one more comment from you before we sort of turn the cameras on. You talked about how the telco community has really approached this cybersecurity issue in a proactive way. Can you elaborate on that just for a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. The telecom sector really embraced a voluntary industry-led approach to cybersecurity. There is a tool called the Framework of Cybersecurity Standards, which the National Institute of Standards and Technology developed in collaboration with the telecom and other sectors. Now, that came out in early 2014, and when it did, the telecom people just really ran with it, and they embraced it, and they've been implementing it from the big trade associations like TIA and US Telecom. They've been spreading that out through their members, and they had a very good working relationship with their regulator, the Federal Communications Commission, which also embraced this idea that, you know what, we can't dictate cybersecurity standards. We as the government can't tell you what's going to be the best way to protect your system. It's really beyond the capability of government bureaucrats to do that. But on the other hand, the industry has to take responsibility and has to really prove that it's doing things to improve security. And the telecom folks have been at the cutting edge of that. It's been pretty impressive.
Charlie, it's a pleasure to have you on our stage. I will get to that book. It sounds very interesting. Great. And it really has a real policy sort of spin to it, if you will. So I think it's of interest to us folks over in the DC area. So
great.
Thanks again for being here.
Great, thank you. Appreciate
Thanks, Charlie. And thank you for joining us at TIA 2016 from the Dell TIA NOW studio. For more coverage, please visit tianow.org. So long.